So, the two armies that ultimately come here to fight are the Union Army of the Cumberland, initially under the command of Major General William Stark Rosecrans, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee under the command of General Braxton Bragg. Now, these two armies ultimately are initially in the summer of 1863 are fighting up in central Tennessee. During the course of the summer and into the fall of 63, they're going to make their way through these gaps and passes and into the city of Chattanooga. In early September, the Union Army is going to force the Confederate Army to abandon this city by convincing General Bragg that he's about to be besieged in this city, which is, of course, the last thing that you really want as a commander that can already hardly supply his forces. And so early September, the Confederate Army evacuates the city. The Union Army is going to come in a couple of days later, and then they also follow the Confederate Army. And during the next week and a half, there's a lot of skirmishing and maneuvering down in northwestern Georgia, ultimately resulting in the Battle of Chickamauga, which takes place about 12 miles south of the city of Chattanooga. The Battle of Chickamauga, over 2.5 days in late September of 1863, is the second bloodiest battle in the Civil War. 120,000 men engaged along the banks of the West Chickamauga Creek. 34,000 of those men become casualties. That's a casualty rate of about 28%, which is unheard of today. We don't see casualties anywhere close to that in the wars that we fight today. So, now this is the last major Confederate victory of the war, and after the Battle of Chickamauga, what's left of the Union Army is going to retreat back into the city of Chattanooga. Now, Chattanooga has been a target since the beginning of the war, and so there are already a series of earthen trenches and forts that surround this city, and so they're going to occupy those defenses. When the Confederate Army shows up, they're going to look at these defenses and they're going to think this is going to be suicidal to try to take this city in a frontal assault. And so they decide to try to starve the Union Army out. And so they lay siege to the city. Essentially, if you can see this map, I'll try to hold it up where everybody can see it. This is the city of Chattanooga here. You've got the Tennessee River that you can see it kind of meandering below us here. We're standing here near the point of Lookout Mountain. The Union Army is right here in Chattanooga, and the Confederate Army is going to occupy a position along the base of Missionary Ridge, which, if you look across the valley here, that first major rise that you see on the other side of Chattanooga that pretty much extends as far as you can see up to the river, that is Missionary Ridge. And so the Confederate Army occupies a line along the base of Missionary Ridge across the Chattanooga Valley below us. They go around the base of Lookout Mountain where we're standing right now, so essentially down below us here, and then they're going to extend along the western side of this bend in the river below us, sort of out of sight from where we are right now. And from this position, they're effectively able to cut off most of the Union supplies coming into the city, the Union supply base being down at Chattanooga. And so for the first month or so, the situation gets pretty dire for these Union soldiers. This is an account from Private Esau Beaumont of the 3rd Wisconsin Light Artillery. Private Beaumont remembered, he said, immediately our horse feed became scarce and grazing was soon used up. Some of the boys would crawl through the lines and pull grass for feed while they would be in the shelter of anything to screen them from sharpshooters. They would put the grass in corn sacks and drag them in behind themselves to our own lines. The rebels were within short range but never shot anyone, undoubtedly thinking it was surrender or starvation in a short time. The little corn soon disappeared and the horses in the best condition were sent to Bridgeport to save their lives. Many had already died tied to trees or posts, which they gnawed as long as they had strength. During the siege, 10,000 horses and mules died of starvation. So it's a pretty desperate situation here. There are accounts of Union soldiers once the Union Army in late October is finally able to force supplies into the city. There are accounts of Union soldiers literally crawling on their hands and knees, abandoning all sense of dignity, crawling on their hands and knees in the mud to pick out individual kernels of corn or pieces of crackers that might have fallen off the wagon so that they could have some sense of sustenance, right? But luckily for these soldiers, there's a lot more going on that is going to affect what happens here in Chattanooga in the fall of 1863. Namely, what happens 2 months prior to this in the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. And July 4th, 151 years ago today, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi falls to the Union, effectively severing the Confederacy's control of the Mississippi River, cutting the South in half. All right, but why that is important for us here is that this puts General Ulysses Grant into the national limelight. You might have heard about him in school. Now, Ulysses Grant, is, because of his victory in Mississippi, is given command of all of the Union forces west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, and once he is given command of all these forces, the next most dire situation within his field of command is right here in Chattanooga. And so here is where he comes. He shows up here in mid-October, and he's going to look at the defenses. He's going to talk to soldiers. He's going to talk to generals. He's going to look at where Bragg is. He's going to talk to Rosecrans to see what, in fact, has been going on. And so ultimately, he decides that Rosecrans has not been doing enough to try to stop, to break this siege. And so he ends up firing William Stark Rosecrans. He puts George Thomas in command of the Army of the Cumberland, but essentially for the next month and a half, General Grant is going to be the guy in control here in Chattanooga. And now Ulysses Grant was a pretty aggressive type of general, and so immediately once he shows up here, he starts making plans to supply his soldiers, and this involves what becomes known as breaking the cracker line. Now the cracker line, of course, would indicate the hardtack crackers, which was the staple of the Union diet during this course of the war, and they're going to try to bring these crackers in from the city of Bridgeport, Alabama, which is through the mountains in this direction. All right, now, General Bragg, the Confederate commander, does not have enough soldiers to effectively control all of this terrain that he's trying to control. And so, about 3 o'clock in the morning on October 27th, General Grant puts about 1,500 soldiers on pontoon boats. He's going to float them down the river under the cover of darkness, underneath the muzzles of the guns here on Lookout Mountain. And he's going to attack a ferry that dates back to 1805 called Brown's Ferry. Now, Brown's Ferry is, you can't see it from here. It's pretty much right in this direction, but you wouldn't be able to see it even if you went to the Western Overlook. There's nothing left there today. But at Brown's Ferry in 1863, there were 2 regiments of Confederate soldiers. A couple hundred of these soldiers are there. Only 7 are awake about 6 o'clock in the morning when these Union soldiers are going to come out of the mist, charge off these boats, and very quickly overtake that position. There's a brief skirmish in the immediate aftermath of that attack, but essentially you've got, within a very short amount of time, these 1,500 soldiers secure control of Brown's Ferry. Now this is important because if you can take Brown's Ferry, then you can bring supplies across the neck of Moccasin Bend down here below us and into Chattanooga from the north. Well, this is important because this is out of range of Confederate artillery on Lookout Mountain. And so you can essentially, if you can get supplies to that point, then they're not going to be able to shell these supply lines as they come into Chattanooga. But they first have to get supplies to that point. And so the next day, General Joseph Hooker, under the commanding about 10,000 Union soldiers, is going to advance up the valley from Bridgeport, and he ends up dispersing what little Confederate resistance there is down here in the valley. And after some brief fighting, he ends up taking control, or he ends up connecting Bridgeport, Alabama, the Union supply base, with Brown's Ferry, and they can start bringing supplies in out of range of Confederate artillery on Lookout Mountain. And so on October 28th, finally, within only about 24 hours of actually trying to do this, the Union Army opens the supply line, which shows you, I think, just how ineffective the Confederate siege really was, and just how little that General Rosecrans was actually doing to try to break this siege.